Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Episode 76. I'll have Seleucia back now. Last time, we left off with Antiochus III preparing to launch an attack on Egypt. Today, let's see how that particular adventure plays off. We'll mostly be relying on the histories of Polybius, with a bit of Edwin Bevan in the supporting role. In the spring of 220 BCE, Antiochus held a council at Apamea to ask for advice about attacking Hollow Syria. Apollophanes, the doctor we mentioned in connection with the death of Hermias, cut through the din of discussion by saying how shameful it was that Seleucia was being held by the Ptolemies. He said that this should be the priority rather than Hollow Syria. Not only was the city of cultural importance, it also had strategic importance. The council agreed with the Apollophanes, and the decision was made to take Seleucia. Antiochus III sent a fleet under Diognetus towards the city, while he led his own army towards Seleucia, setting up a base at a nearby hippodrome. He also dispatched an army under the generals Hemioleus and Theodotus towards Hollow Syria to prevent leaving himself vulnerable to attack from the south. Antiochus sent out entreaties to city notables, trying to get them to hand over the town without any bloodshed. These fell on deaf ears. However, he did manage to get through to some underlings and used information he got from them to get his attack ready. His plan was to simultaneously throw himself at the city on land and at sea. The army was divided into three in preparation for the assault on Seleucia. Zeuxis, the satrap from the whole Molon episode, commanded a force situated on the gateway towards Antioch. A general called Hermogenes was positioned by something called the Dioscurium, although I haven't been able to find out what exactly this refers to. Finally, Antiochus III entrusted the naval assault to Ardis and Diognetus, with their target being the dock neighbourhood. The reason for this was that the underlings in Seleucia had promised him the city would be handed over to him, provided that they could take this region of the city. Antiochus's forces stormed Seleucia. Diognetus and Ardis' attack was easiest, because it was easier to get ladders against the walls here rather than on the land side. Ardis rapidly took the suburbs, and when he did, the underlings who had been swayed sought out their commander Leontius and argued for coming to terms before Antiochus took Seleucia in its entirety. It's interesting to note the name Leontius, as it's one that comes up in much later Byzantine history during the 7th century CE. Regardless, this Leontius, not being an emperor and not knowing of the corruption of his underlings, agreed. In turn, Antiochus agreed to spare all the free people in the city. He also left a force in Seleucia and brought back those who had been evicted when Ptolemy III took the city during the Third Syrian War. At the same time, Antiochus received a dispatch from the Aetolian Theodotus, offering to give him Hollow Syria. Now, Theodotus had served the Ptolemies, as we discussed previously. However, he was now fearing for his life and disillusioned by the court and the king. Therefore, Theodotus had rebelled, taking Tyre and Ptolemais and asking Antiochus to invade, hence the letter. Antiochus put off everything else, including a reprisal against Achaeus, and swept towards Hollow Syria. He arrived at a lake in the same Marsyas valley as before, learning that an Egyptian force was besieging Theodotus at Ptolemais. He left his heavy forces behind to take a strategic settlement in the valley, while he himself and his light cavalry raced towards Ptolemais to help Theodotus. The Ptolemaic general in charge of the siege retreated, and Antiochus, after mopping up forces that were left behind to take a nearby settlement, waited for the rest of his army to arrive. Once they did, he moved on Ptolemais. Both it and Tyre were promptly handed over by Theodotus and his friends. Antiochus gave their navies to his admiral Diognetus. Bevan mentions that Antiochus was so flushed with success that he wanted to undertake an all-out assault on Egypt. Polybius concurs, mentioning that Antiochus wanted to attack Pelusium. However, when he learned that Ptolemy had quit Memphis and was massing at Pelusium, he abandoned this idea in favour of moving around the region, trying to convince cities to his side. He found some success in smaller areas which were easier to intimidate, but many larger settlements refused him, and he became bogged down in sieges as a result. Now, this was apparently a bad decision, as Egypt would have been ripe for the taking. The Egyptian army had been suffering from neglect, and so was not powerful enough for Ptolemy IV to consider coming to the aid of Hollow Syria. Sosibius and a fellow advisor called Agathocles tried to get the country ready for war, but at the same time reached out to Antiochus. Their goal was to convince him of how cowardly Ptolemy IV was. Essentially, they were giving Antiochus III a false sense of security in the idea that Ptolemy IV would abandon Hollow Syria. The negotiations, when they began, gave Egypt time to prepare. By the winter of 219 to 218 BCE, Antiochus was still stuck besieging a port in Hollow Syria. He knew that the winter would likely hurt his army. At the same time, he was also afraid of an imminent attack by Achaeus. As a result, he settled for a 4-month truce with Egypt and travelled back to Seleucia. He left forces behind in the area and left Theodotus the Aetolian in charge of the region. Throughout the winter, Egypt prepared, while the Seleucids continued to underestimate them. In point of fact, Antiochus let his armies go for the winter. I'm not quite sure why, given that he seems to have been worried previously about Achaeus attacking him. Maybe he got intelligence through that Achaeus wasn't actually trying anything. That said, the truce he'd agreed to didn't go anywhere, as both sides were entrenched in what they wanted. The matter of Achaeus was also a sticking point during the talks. Egypt wanted any peace between the two to apply to him as well, while Antiochus objected to Egypt butting in on an internal Seleucid conflict. Accordingly, in the spring of 218 BCE, war started up once again. It is with hostilities resuming that we will leave off for today. As always, thank you for listening. Feel free to get in touch at the show's email address for any questions or comments. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.